Hello, my name is Gabriel Saeed Reynolds. I teach Islamic Studies and Theology here at the University of Notre Dame. I've also written this book, Christianity and the Qur'an. But don't worry, this is not a video that's just a shameless and desperate effort to get you to buy the book. In fact, I'm going to give you the principal arguments of Christianity and the Qur'an in a succinct and useful fashion so you don't have to buy the book. Let me go right ahead and share my screen so I can give you all the facts about this book, which has a bit of a controversial thesis, but is also based up with real data. Oh my gosh, look at that. Right now, it is official that Christianity and the Quran is available as an audiobook on Amazon and everywhere else. So you can get it in that form, or you can get the traditional form, and you can get the ebook form for your Kindle or whatever. What this book does not argue is first that the Quran is Christian. So even if it is Christianity in the Quran, I'm not arguing that there's some secret Christian meaning to the Quran that I've uncovered. Two, I do not argue that Muslim scholars have gotten the Quran's message all wrong. I'm not correcting over 1,400 years of Islamic scholarship. And three, I am not arguing in some sort of conspiratorial way that Islam really began in Palestine or Syria and not in Mecca and Medina. There are plenty of folks out there who have those sorts of ideas, but I hold that Islam began in the traditional site that Muslims believe it began. So what am I arguing? Well, that Arabia at the time was overwhelmingly Christian, and that the Quran's principal conversation partner, that the audience with which the Quran's author is engaging was overwhelmingly Christian. So that is a provocative argument, and it breaks with a long tradition of Western academic scholarship, which saw Christianity in Arabia as almost non-existent, or if there were Christians in Muhammad's Arabia, they would have been sort of a few lone souls who wandered into the desert. Probably they had some strange heretical way of thinking about Christianity. There you have a thought from the American Protestant scholar Speer, who in this missionary conference in 1911 thought, well, if Muhammad had only met a good Christian, maybe like him, he would have actually become a Christian maybe, but he only met a very debased type of Christianity. Even more standard scholars like Hamilton Gibb, who was a professor at super famous university says that, there was no real organized Jewish or Christian community in Arabia. There were just, these heretical churches there. This view has not gone away. It's not only books that were published based on a 1911 conference in India, but in the 21st century, there are very serious, excellent scholars who still hold that the area around Muhammad was overwhelmingly pagan and idolatrous. Famously, Aziz al-Azmi, in his book, The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity, spoke about the region of the Hijaz, Mecca, Medina as a pagan reservation. So why do I disagree with all of these scholars who argue that there weren't a lot of Christians around? Let's give some of the evidence here. First of all, that if you look internally at the Quran itself, one finds imprints of a biblical culture, not quotations of the Bible, but yes, biblical turns of phrase. For example, the phrase, the camel passing through the needle's eye. This is famously in the Gospels. It is hard for someone rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. I tell you again, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for someone rich to enter heaven. In the Quran, we find the turn of phrase, a camel passing through the needle's eye, but it's not about a rich person, intriguingly. It's about someone who denies God's signs. Other biblical turns of phrase in the Quran, our hearts are uncircumcised, the uncircumcised heart that's found in the prophets in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. For example, the speech that Stephen, the first Christian martyr, gives before the Sanhedrin, as recorded in the 5th book of the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles. It's found twice in the Quran, 288 and 4155. Both times the Israelites, who are also the principal target of the idea of uncircumcised hearts in the Bible, but in both times in the Quran, the Israelites are made to say themselves, our hearts are uncircumcised. Other turns of phrase, very familiar to those who know the New Testament, something very small is compared to a mustard seed. the coming of the day of resurrection is compared to the twinkling of the eye. That's intriguing because it's in a letter of Paul. It's in 1 Corinthians, and the Quran does not seem to recognize Paul as an authoritative and inspired prophet, but nevertheless, it uses a Pauline turn of phrase. All of these together suggest that biblical language was in the air, and even that we don't have direct quotations, in other words, that the Quran uses biblical turns of phrase in a new way, suggests that people spoke this way. The Quran wasn't copying a copy of the Bible, but rather people around the Quran's author tended to use biblical turns of phrase to express their points. Now, there are also longer passages in the Quran, more significant engagement with Christian tradition, Christian legends in the Quran. I go into some detail about these in Christianity and the Quran. These don't always come from the canonical Bible themselves, but they tend to come from Christian sources. So, for example, the Quran on 7 different occasions speaks about the prostration or the bowing of the angels before Adam. And this leads eventually to the fall of the devil, because he is the one angel who will not bow down to the devil, saying proudly, I was made from fire, but Adam was made from dirt. So we have this tradition, for example, in the life of Adam and Eve, in which it's made to explain why the devil is out to get humans, because he's jealous and frustrated of man, to whom all the angels were made to bow, who was given more honor than him, and who led to his own downfall. This is found in both the life of Adam and Eve, a text with Jewish origins, but transmitted by Christians, and in the Quran itself on 7 different occasions. One further example is the story of young men who went into a cave and fell asleep for an unnaturally long amount of time, and then were miraculously raised again from their sleep, which seems to be an example of the resurrection of the body. Intriguingly, when the Quran tells this story in Surah Al-Kahf, Quran 18, it gives instructions to its own followers not to consult with any of them about the sleepers, the young men in the cave. Who are them? Presumably Christians, because the story was originally told by Christians. Its origins are in the 4th, 5th century. It's told in the 6th century by Jacob of Sarug. It's very, very well documented that this was a popular Christian story. And the Quran seems to be saying, not only does it tell the story of the sleepers, but it counsels its audience not to ask Christians about the story. Now, wait a second. If there were even a possibility of asking Christians about the story, that means among the Quran's audience were Christians. Now, there's not only internal evidence for the Quran's engagement with Christianity, there's also evidence now, thanks to the great work of people like Ahmad al-Jalad, Haytham Sidki, and others who have documented and analyzed pre-Islamic inscriptions in Arabia. Now, I'd just like to get this quotation out here from Quran 16:103, because here the Quran speaks about someone who seems to be speaking another language and who enemies or opponents say is teaching Muhammad. But what is this other language? What is this other speech? It points to a situation in which there was bilingualism, both sort of the official, ritual, liturgical, sacred language of Christians in the region, which was Aramaic or Syriac, and Arabic, which was spoken by Christians on an everyday business. We also have material evidence, actual inscriptions, which date from, in this case, the middle of the 6th century. Remember, Islam begins by tradition around 610. The Prophet Muhammad is born by tradition in AD 570. So here we have an inscription that can be dated to about 550. And, it has language, including El-Ilah, which is like Allah for God, which is definitely monotheistic, but is it Jewish or Christian? Well, guess what? There's a cross on the end, which tells us that is Christian. This inscription comes from the northern part of what is Saudi Arabia today, not too far from the region of Mecca, Medina. Oh, look at this. There's the image of the inscription itself. It's in this section of the rock, and you can see the Christian cross there. And just for fun, it's kind of cool to see the nice images of camels on the rock inscription. A couple more quick points on the presence of Christians in pre-Islamic Arabia. Well, more and more we're discovering not only inscriptions with crosses, but actually monasteries and evidence of settled Christian communities. This is from the eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula, in what is today the UAE. But it does show that in that part of the peninsula there were Christians. And over in the West, where the Qur'an originated, we have references in the Qur'an itself to cloisters, sawame, probably a word that comes from Ethiopic, churches, other places of prayer or oratories. Some people think this word is a reference to synagogues, and mosques. They're all referred to as positive things. And if the Qur'an is worried about the possible destruction of these buildings, it suggests that in its very presence, there were monasteries and churches around. There are also signs that the Qur'an is even praising monks in the Qur'an, right after the famous light verse, which begins, Allahu nur as-samawati wal ard, God is the heavens, rather, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. It actually continues. So people tend to end with the end of the light verse, but if you look, the next verse picks this up and explains where this light is coming from. Fi biyut, it's coming in houses or in temples, which God has allowed to be raised up, in which men commemorate his name in the mornings and evenings. What are these temples, or what are these biyut? In which men praise his name morning and evening. Well, we have a clue in verse 37 when we realize that the Qur'an is speaking of men who are not diverted by commerce or trafficking. What is the group of men who live in temples or houses, who praise God morning and evening, who have no commerce or trade? Their only concern is praising God. This is a reference to monasteries. Those are the principal arguments of the book. I mean, you've got it all there, but if you feel compelled to buy the book, Christianity and the Qur'an, again, you can find it now not only in the traditional book format, but also as an audiobook or as an ebook form. Friends, thank you so much. Also, while you're here, might as well subscribe to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. See you next time. Bye-bye.